Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about paint. Specifically, how do you select paints? How do you test and evaluate a new paint, whether it's new to the market or new to you? How do you test that? How do you decide if it's something you want to use? I mean, sure, you can always just try it and see if you like it. And if you do, you buy it. And if you don't buy it. And well, now that I think of it, I guess that's pretty much the whole video. All right, I'm done. No. I wanted to share some of the steps that I've used over the years in terms of deliberately, purposefully evaluating a paint. Because I've found that if I do that, it helps ultimately the look of my models. They're going to look better because I'm using paints that are working well for me. And also it can save some money because I'm not spending a lot on paints that in the long run I'm not going to end up using. And I can say that because I've had to learn that part the hard way. I suppose the first thing I probably ought to do is kind of talk a little bit about the various types of paints that we use in modeling. Generally, they're going to fall under three categories. You're going to have your lacquers, your enamels, and your acrylics. Each of them have their own benefits. Each of them have their own drawbacks. I'm not here to try and say you need to use acrylics or you need to use lacquers or you need to use enamels. That's not what this is about. It's about evaluating paints. So this method should apply to any type of paint that you're wanting to examine or to work with. I would say, just as kind of an underlying tip, I think it's better to be comfortable with using a variety of paint types, simply because some you want to take advantage of their strengths in some areas, but in other areas, another type of paint, you want to take advantage of its strengths. There's no problem with settling on one type. If you say, look, for health reasons or availability reasons, I'm settling on acrylics, not settling, I'm using acrylics exclusively, great, do it. But don't forget that each type has their own strengths, so keep that in mind when you're evaluating any type of paint. For the purposes of this video, the major distinctions between lacquer, enamel, and acrylic has to do with the thinner that makes all of them work. And it would be a whole nother video to go into comparing and contrasting those and what goes into them and looking at brands. Suffice to say, in general, lacquers, enamels, and acrylics don't mix. So you can't use them together in terms of mixing colors. Now, one can go over the top of the other with some caveats, which again is another video. But generally, the hotter or more caustic, the thinner, the less you're going to want to put it over something that has a less caustic thinner. For example, if you paint acrylic onto a surface, acrylic paint, and then you put lacquers over the top of it, especially if you're brush painting and you're putting it on kind of heavy, that lacquer thinner may activate or mess with the underlying layers. So you need to keep that in mind. But for the sake of this video, we're going to treat each of those as distinct things that can't necessarily be mixed. But the testing and evaluation procedure is generally going to be the same. Now, when you pick a type of paint that you want to evaluate, you're going to have questions about how it works. How does it operate within other types of paints that are similar? For example, in acrylics, there's a lot of different brands of acrylic paint. There's also different lines within the same brand. So, for example, Vallejo has quite a few different ranges within their brand. So there's a lot of variation out there, but if you follow a few simple rules, it should help you in your testing and evaluation. Okay, the first thing that I think you want to look at is, how do you typically use your paints? If you're exclusively a brush painter guy or exclusively an airbrush guy, then, you know, that's going to determine how you use your paints. If you do a little hybrid, then you need to determine, do I do, you know, 50-50? Do I do 70% brush, 30% airbrush? You know, is the airbrush just used for base colors and then everything else is brush painting? Or do you do a lot of fine blends and multiple colors and some, you know, very precise work with your airbrush? Because there's some paints that work better through an airbrush than using a hairy stick, a brush. So keeping in mind what your goal is for that paint, I think, is the first step. What am I going to be using this most often for? Because there's some paints that are really handy, really useful for one type of thing, but not so much the other. I really like brush painting Citadel paint. I don't like airbrushing Citadel paint. I can do it, I've done it, I've forced myself to do it so I learn how to use it, but it's not one that's optimal for the way I work for airbrushing, but I love it for brush painting. However, I love Tamiya paints, Tamiya acrylic paints for airbrushing. They're great for that. They're apart from lacquer paints, I think they're the best there are for airbrushing. But I'm not real big on brush painting those because they have their challenges there. So kind of define, when you're looking at any paint, what are you going to be doing with that paint primarily? Not that you can't, you know, I've done a video on brush painting Tamiya acrylics, and you can make that work. Could I have done that simpler with something else? Absolutely. I just wanted to do a video on how to do it. But evaluating what your primary use is, I think, is step one. First, I'm going to look at some things to consider when you're airbrushing. First thing is, what kind of thinner does it use? Quite often, you can use thinners made for one brand for another brand of paint. But if you're evaluating a paint for the first time, I'm a strong believer in using the thinner recommended for that paint. And here's the reason I say that. If you're using a new paint, new to you, and you're trying to make it work with a thinner that's not designed for that paint, your evaluation of that paint may be marred, not because of a problem with the paint, but because of a problem with the thinner. I used to just, you know, if it was any kind of Tamiya type paint, you know, whether it was the Gunza Aqueous, I think is what they call it. I can never remember all those names for the Mr. Color stuff. If it was any of those types of paints, you know, I just used alcohol to thin them. And I knew I could make that work for Tamiya. But when I started trying that with other paints that were similar to that, it didn't always work. But when I would drop back, spend a few more bucks to get some thinner and that was made for that paint and work with that thinner in my evaluation, I had much better results. And then I could see, okay, now I see it does work and it works well. Now let me start testing interoperability. That was a hard word. Interoperability of thinner to see how that works. Now, a big question that always comes up with any kind of paint when somebody's using a paint for the first time, I see it almost every day in social media, is how much do I thin the paint? And again, this video is not about thinning paint, but the way I do it is, if I'm starting to evaluate a paint, I start with a 50-50 ratio. 50% paint, 50% thinner. That's a decent starting point. And as you start airbrushing and testing it, you'll see, is that too much? Is that too little? Generally, you can look in the color cup. If you do a 50-50 ratio of thinner to paint, you can look in the color cup and you can see That's either way, way too thin or that's still a little too thick. And so you can adjust it from there. But that's a good starting point when you're doing your evaluation. Another thing I like to look at when I'm testing a new paint is how is its coverage? And I like to do that generally in some kind of extreme condition. Anytime I'm evaluating something, I've got a couple of little models that I use solely for just putting coats of paint on to see how they work. They're just test mules. And sometimes I'll come up with an extreme condition to see how it covers. For example, if I'm testing a white paint and I want to see how that white paint goes onto a model, I'll prime the model. I'll just prime the whole thing in black and see, okay, how long does it take me to build up color? How close to pure white can I get over a black primer? Does that reflect what you might do in reality? No, but it gives you a good feel for how well that paint covers. Because I've tested some paints that I could get a good coverage of white in just a few coats over a black primer, and I'm like, that's a good strong white paint. There have been others that I've tested that I would put coat after coat after coat after coat, and you never really beat that. Now, it's not to say that you reject the one that takes a lot longer, a white paint that takes a lot longer to cover black, but it's something to factor in if coverage is something you're really valuing. Another thing I like to look at is my ability to get thin coats. There are some types of paints that are better at that than others. And by thin coats, I mean if you thin it down, way down, I mean 10% paint, 90% thinner, can you get a good airbrush coat where you're able to get some really nice blends, some really nice shading and fading effects without a lot of the paint bleeding, spider webbing across the model? Can you drop the air pressure really low? Here's an example. One of the things I love about Tamiya paints for airbrushing is I can thin those with alcohol, and I'll put the color cup 3/4 full of just 91% isopropyl alcohol, and I'll put in maybe half a brush full of Tamiya paint, and I can dial the pressure down to about 12-15 psi, and using a fine needle airbrush, 0.2 or 0.3, get in really close and do some really fine effects, and it works really well. How many times can you say really all at once? It works really well. The alcohol evaporates quickly, the paint goes down very, very nice. I can build up layers, they're very thin, so it works in just perfect fashion. There are other acrylics that I've taken and tried to do the same thing using appropriate thinners for whatever that brand was, and thinning it way down and dropping the air pressure. And it can be a lot harder to work with really thin paint. So I think that has to be part of the evaluation process, is how far down can I thin this stuff and airbrush it and not have the medium, the thinner, running all over the model. So for me, that's a very important test. Another very important factor when it comes to airbrushing is tip dry. That's the phenomenon where as you're airbrushing, paint will dry as it comes out of the airbrush, and on the tip of the needle of your airbrush, it'll start building up. You see this especially with water-based acrylics. Not so much with enamels and lacquers, although it can happen. You really don't see that very much in those, but with water-based acrylics, you can see it. And so anytime I'm evaluating a paint for airbrushing, I look at the tip dry. Again, that's not something that necessarily makes me say I'm not going to use that brand of paint, but knowing how it's going to behave in regards to tip dry lets me know, is it worth getting? Because quite often you're not going to find a paint, I haven't yet, that when I start using it, it makes me think this is so much better than everything else I used. I just want to put all that I've used aside and buy this one paint. I just haven't found that yet. I kind of got close to that when I started airbrushing with lacquers. I love my Tamiya paints, but there's some circumstances when you're airbrushing with lacquers that they're just so awesome that it made me go out and buy a bunch of lacquers. But I didn't get rid of my Tamiya paints. But that tip dry, if something is really bad about tip dry, then that can be a huge factor. There was a paint that I used a few years ago, an acrylic paint. I think it's pronounced Hataka. I believe it's made in Poland. And I heard good things about it. I liked the color range. I got the paints. Everything looked good. No matter what I did, I had the worst tip dry with that paint than I think any other acrylic paint I've used. And I talked to other people who use it and they go, no, I don't really have that kind of problems. I was using their thinner and doing all of the things that were recommended. It was so bad that I said, I'm not going to use this paint. It's just not worth it. Whereas with other acrylic paints that I've used, you can put in some thinner. I like Vallejo because I can put in thinner. I can put in some of the airbrush medium, and that is going to make that work really well. And I don't really have too many problems with tip dry. But tip dry is a factor to consider when evaluating your paints. A final thing to look at when you're evaluating your paints for airbrushing is cleanup. That's, there again, that's an area that while I've tested some paints to see if I liked them, and I may like the color, I may like the coverage, I may not have problems with tip dry. When I get to the cleanup, if that's a bear, if it's tough to get that out of the airbrush, I've not used paints solely because of that. An example is Humbrol acrylics. I liked the range of colors they had. I liked using the paint. I didn't think it was the best acrylic paint on the market, but when I was testing it, I thought, okay, it works pretty good. But when I got to cleaning out my airbrush, most paints I can run some thinner through until it's clean and everything's good. Every time I used Humbrol acrylics, I had to disassemble the airbrush and completely clean the thing. And after a few bouts of that, I said, it's just not worth it. There's no point in investing any more money in this paint because it didn't give me anything other than maybe a few color choices that I couldn't find in other brands. And the negative of cleaning the airbrush was so much that I said, I'm just not going to do it. So look at how the paint cleans up after you get through using it. Okay, when it comes to evaluating paints for brush painting, my criteria is a little different that I look at. One of the things I look at is what does it need to thin the paint? I mean, obviously I evaluate it with, as I talked about with airbrushing, I evaluate it with the manufacturer's recommended thinner. But when it comes to brush painting, I think you have a little more flexibility to say, let me try this thinner from this other brand. How does it work if it's an acrylic paint? How does it work with water? How does it work with mediums? How does it work with all of those other things that I thin with? And then with regards to thinning, how does it hold up under thinning? There are some paints, and this applies for acrylics, that when I'm brush painting, I can thin them down a lot and they still hold together pretty well. They go on, they give good coverage. The paint doesn't break up or look, clumpy or anything like that. Others, you get too much water in them or other kinds of thinners like that, they can break up and not look as good. Now there may be other mediums that you can use to avoid that, but that's definitely something that I look at first and foremost is how well does it thin with a variety of things, with the manufacturer's thinner, with water, with things like flow improver or acrylic mediums or any of those different products that you can use in this example, with acrylic paints. So keeping that in mind will help you determine which paint has more flexibility, because I think that's what I look for in brush painting, is flexibility. Can I use it in a variety of situations? So very much make that your number one evaluation point, I think. Another thing to look at with brush painting, and again, this really leans heavily into acrylics, is what mediums are available to use with that acrylic paint. Are there glazing mediums? Are there various thinning mediums? Are there matte mediums, gloss mediums, satin mediums? What can you put in with it to make the paint and the color behave on the model and achieve the effect that you're wanting to get done? If it has a wide range of things available for it, that's going to be of benefit. If it doesn't have a wide range of things that will work with it, then again, that's something to keep in mind as you're working with the paint to see if it's going to be a fit for you. Of course, a very critical factor is how's the coverage of the paint? Is it smooth? If you're trying to build up a base paint, a base color very quick, can you get it done in 2 thin coats, so to speak? Can you do it in 2 or 3 coats? Can you thin it down with various mediums to do glazing? Can you build up glazing layers without it getting clumpy? If you just touch it, is it going down smooth? If you're doing a good job of putting down just thin coats to build up a base, is it smooth? Does it clog detail more than other paints? All of those things, how it covers the model, all of those things have to be looked at in evaluating paint for brush painting, especially I think with acrylics, because that's the most common thing that you're going to see with brush painting. But I've done some, following the example of Lincoln Wright, I've been working more with brush painting lacquers, and I'm seeing a difference between lacquer paints and how they work, because lacquer, you put down a coat of lacquer paint and you brush paint over it. When you start brush painting over it, that second coat's gonna activate the lower coat, the coat underneath. So I've seen, even between brands, there's some differences there. There's some differences between thinners. So how the paint covers the model, how when it dries, what is the type of finish? Is it satin? Is it gloss? Is it matte? All of those things go into evaluating the coverage and how it's actually going to work on the model. Okay, I think there's just a few other general considerations that would go into any type of paint, whether you're using it for airbrushing, brush painting, whatever. The first one that I always look for is durability. I've already talked about that a little at the beginning, but for the models I'm working on, how is it going to stand up to the handling I have to do while I'm building the model? Now, you can take precautions as far as wearing, I've worn cotton gloves to make sure that I'm not scratching paint. But if you're building, again, I use this as an example, if you're building Gundam, they move. How well does the paint hold up to moving? How well does it just hold up to, like I said, the basic handling when you're doing the rest of the finishing? There are some paints that I've put onto a model and I got a nice thin coat and the color looked good and everything seemed to be going well, and I took out the dry brush that I always use and I started dry brushing something, and on raised edges it would take the paint right off. The paint was so weak that it couldn't hold up to just the process of dry brushing. And for most dry brushing, I use one of those brushes that my wife gave to me that she uses on her eye stuff up here. So, I mean, we're talking a soft brush that's designed to be, stabbed into your eye. So it's not a harsh brush. Testing the durability under various conditions. If just normal handling of the model, the paint rubs off. Now, maybe you did something wrong with the thinning in the application. Maybe it needed a better primer or whatever. But after a while, when you're evaluating a paint and you see this is just not durable, that may be a factor to consider when you're deciding, should I invest more money in this? Another factor, and I again briefly mentioned this earlier, is interoperability. Can this work with what I already have? For example, when I'm getting a new acrylic paint, I want to know if I have a bottle of this paint that I'm evaluating for the first time, am I going to be able to mix it with this other bottle of paint that I already have to get a particular shade? It's not that if it's not interoperable, it's not that I won't use it at all, but it's handy to know how well does it play with the others. And that counts for lacquer paints, enamel paints, any of those things. You know, I invested in some more lacquer paints because I found that I could mix them with some of my existing Tamiya paints. And even though intuitively I thought, well, maybe these won't work as well, there was some good interoperability there, and I was able to make use of that. Same way with my water-based paints. Do these play well with others? There have been a few brands that I've mixed acrylic paints together, and they didn't quite work together. They didn't gel. One in particular, Humbrol acrylics. When I started mixing it with some Vallejo paints, the Humbrol, it kind of mixed, but part of it just kind of clumped up and broke apart and just started doing some really odd things. And I thought, okay, that tells me something I need to know right there. So look at the interoperability of the paints with what you already have. Another factor I like to look at is the toxicity of the paint. If you have any kind of breathing issues, if you have any kind of physical issues, there may be certain brands of paint that you can't use. I have some friends that have breathing issues, and when they try to use enamel paints, it causes them serious physical problems. Same way with lacquers. So they have to stick exclusively to acrylics. If you have kids in the house, if you're having to work where your family may be, even if you're using proper ventilation and things like that, that toxicity may come into play. Even if it's just, I don't ever want my kid to get the bottle of paint and because it's a colored fluid think it's something to drink, you know, that would have been me. You know, hey, let me see what this is. Oh, it looks like Kool-Aid. Oh, that was lacquer paint. The likelihood of that happening is probably pretty low, but it can be a factor. So the toxicity of the paint is something to think about. Another factor I always look at is simply availability. How easy is this stuff to get? You know, there can be a paint brand that I may test and evaluate and say, you know, this is better enough, to say it that way. It's better enough that I would like to use this, but it's really hard to get. And if I can't get this paint with some ease, then I may go, the benefits that it has are not quite enough to make me completely move to that paint or to focus on that paint. As I've said, I have liked using lacquer paints, and I will use them every chance I get. But they're more difficult for me to get around here where I live locally, so I have to order them, and that always adds to, you know, you've got to pay the shipping costs and things like that. There's a few shops here in town that I can walk in and they have a full rack of Tamiya paints. So while I will get several colors, and if I can order them through the local shop, I may get them. If I need something in a pinch, I don't order a lacquer color, even though I might like airbrushing with it a little better. I know Tamiya works. I can ride up to the shop, I can get the paint, and I can be back here and working in no time. So availability is certainly a factor to take a look at. Another factor that I would recommend considering is, I've seen this happen a lot, where I would mention Like when I started testing lacquer paints, I bought a few lacquer paints because I wanted to work with them and get more comfortable with them. And a lot of people ask me, they say, well, you're going to throw out your Tamiya paints. And I'm like, I've got hundreds of dollars invested. I have pretty much the full line of Tamiya paints. And in some colors, I have multiple bottles. I've got a lot of money invested in those Tamiya paints. It's not practical to go out and replace every paint you have with one brand. I mean, unless your financial resources are just so deep that you can go, gee, I've just tried this paint and I love it better than any that I've ever found before, so I'm just going to sweep it all off my desk and I'm going to go buy the full range of it and start over. Hey, if you can do that, cool. When you sweep all them old paints off into a box, send them my way. But I don't think it's practical to say I want to replace every paint I have with another brand. And in fact, I don't really focus as much on brand as I do color and availability. Now, you see behind me, there's a lot of Vallejo paints that are back there. And that's because they're easy to get locally. There may be other paints, for example, Ammo of MiG and AK Interactive. I like those paints generally. AK a little more than Ammo. Ammo's kind of thin. But I like those. But Vallejo is all over the place here. There's one shop in town that has just about all of the ranges that Vallejo carries. And so I can walk in and there it is. The others are good, but they're not so good that I'll go, well, I'll order that and pay a little more per bottle simply because I want to have that brand. So I tend to focus on color and availability. And because I've already used a lot of these, I know how they're going to react. So I know I can go pick up bottles of Vallejo or bottles of Tamiya and I know exactly how they're going to perform. So don't, unless you're just really brand inclined or maybe they sponsor you, don't focus as much on brand as you get further into it than color and availability, because the more you use it, the more you know it's going to work and you know how to work with different things. And if you need if you just need a bottle of gray-green paint and you can drive up to the shop and that's near you and pick up a bottle and drive back home and be back to work, that's what I go with. Now, I guess to kind of wrap up, and yes, I am going to wrap up. To wrap up, looking at the factors for evaluating paint, especially if you're looking at, a brand new paint. The bottom line is, does it make the hobby more fun? That, to me, is the ultimate test. I've worked with some paints that worked better than others in terms of maybe they airbrushed a little better or they had a wider range. But if there was some other aggravating factor, more difficult to clean, more difficult to come by, at the end I had to evaluate, did this make the total process fun? Would my model have turned out, because we all want it, ultimately we want it to look cool. If I look at it and evaluate it and go, at the end of the game when I'm looking at the model, did that paint give me more enjoyment getting there? If it was easy to use, if it was, if it didn't present any problems. In other words, it's almost like looking for paint to say, I don't want to think about the paint. Again, I keep bringing them up, but I like using their stuff. When I'm brush painting, when I'm working with acrylics, I love Vallejo because I don't think about, okay, I need to remember to do this or I need to remember to do that. I just kind of go on autopilot. If I need this color, I put it in the palette, I put in whatever thinning medium I'm going to be using, I get whatever brush I'm going to use, I start painting it on, and I just do it. I don't think, okay, now I need to remember that I do this. When I've worked with other paints, Sometimes I have to go, oh, okay, I got to remember that I got to do this or it's not going to work really well. The end game is, does the model look cool and did you have fun getting there? And if a paint detracts from that, it doesn't matter how new it is, how cool it is, how much coverage it's getting, how much everybody else on the market likes it. If it's not something you enjoy using and it doesn't make your models look better, then don't use it. All right, I think I've thoroughly flogged this horse, so I think it's time to wrap up. If you're following me on social media, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your likes, your shares, your encouragement, your comments. I'm really grateful for that. If you're supporting me on Patreon, a super special thank you for that, because that's what allows me to keep going. We wouldn't be able for me to model at the pace I do with the types of materials that I do if it weren't for you. I would have to cut things way back. So thank you very much for your support on Patreon. And if you're not currently supporting me on Patreon, but you like what I do and would like to contribute to that, there's a link down below. There's all my social media links down below, but there's the Patreon link. Please click on that, see what I offer for the Patreon supporters, and see if there's something that you might like to sign up for and support me in. And then, of course, you're here watching the video, please go ahead and click the little subscribe thing here, wherever it is. Please go ahead and click that, and I would be most grateful for that because that helps me grow the channel, which I'm trying to do. So thank you if you've already subscribed, and thank you if you just clicked that button. I appreciate that. And with all that said, I'll leave you with a final thought. If you're not having fun in this hobby, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.